Hello all. Hopefully you can't hear the loud hedge trimming that's going on next door, but it'll be going on for a while, so I've got no choice but to make the video. With that going on, it's been a week, hasn't it, for everybody, I think. I apologise that I haven't really done much in the way of videos this week, but with everything going on around the world, I haven't much felt like it. And there's been things going on that are depressing or annoying that have been hidden because of what's going on around the world. If you're British, I strongly suggest you look into what the COVID inquiry has been revealing about just how incompetent government was and what they were getting up to while all that was going on. I do have some new stuff to review, which I'll be getting around to. I managed to locate a reasonably priced copy of the black cover cult edition, which is the best edition, relatively cheaply, though the shipping wasn't, and wine was spilt on it when it was being shipped to me somehow. So that's fun, isn't it? But yeah, I'll get around to more reviews and things later on. On commentary, I'm just going to address the feedback on the Solidarity with Israel video and none of the others this week, because that was the ripest sort of place. There have been developments. There are other things I want to say. And I don't feel much like addressing the out-and-out racism and xenophobia and so on of the Kalergi plan responses. I know you all look forward to them, but still. Much of the Israel commentary feedback is of the same character, so there you go. So on that video, Tristan Pritchard says, "Why would anyone want to visit this upon their own people? Well, 9/11. At which point, honestly, I stopped reading. Because anyone who suggests that 9/11 was self-inflicted or 7/7 was self-inflicted, yeah, I don't want to hear from you at that point. It's just absurd, particularly all these years later. So that's where I stopped reading." Mr. Triceratops says, "I have become extremely black-pilled about this whole state of affairs. What we just witnessed was Bronze Age savagery inspired by religious hatred. I have no hope for any peaceful solution between these two factions. The term justified anger doesn't even fit what Hamas did. There is nothing justifiable in the intentional attacking of civilians. Hamas and the radicals on Israel's side don't want a peaceful solution, let alone a two-state solution, and unfortunately they're the ones who are driving this conflict." Yeah, and while it's been a while, we shouldn't forget that Hamas was elected and that Israelis elected a very right-wing government as well. And that's part of the problem here, isn't it? Cooler heads can't really prevail when horribleness and viciousness is the democratic choice of the people involved. They want to visit more and more suffering upon each other, and you have a kind of consensus built around that, either from the slow, constant oppression that Israel visits upon Palestinians, or from the vicious and horrific acts that are visited via terrorism upon Israel. That builds a kind of consensus for further horror within both populations, and tit for tat. You know, people often make the comparison with the sectarian conflict in Ireland, or to a slightly lesser degree in Scotland. But while Israel is a more secular society, and there's some hope there that you might be able to cut through the bullshit, the the Palestinian areas aren't sectarians, aren't secular societies. So there's not really a lot of hope there, and I don't think the comparison is too valid until both societies modernise to the same sort of level. But yeah, this seems to be what people were stuck upon. Understanding the oppression that Israel visits upon the Palestinian territories and population doesn't excuse, it explains. Just like how American interference in the Middle East and so on doesn't justify what Al-Qaeda did, but it explains it. To understand a thing is not to excuse a thing, but people seem to have a real issue with managing to understand that about any conflict, let alone this one. Frumpy Crust says, "What a cool way to tell me to unsubscribe from your channel. You have no sense of nuance." While Tawil said, "Knowing you to be a Brit lefty, I was expecting a one-sided reaction from you, but you have here made a good effort to give a balanced account. Good for you, Jim." So, I mean, if you're being told you're unnuanced and unbalanced on one side, but being told that you're being balanced and nuanced on the other, I don't know. The response of a lot of people on the ostensible left, which is a very passive-aggressive way of saying not really on the left, I suppose, has left me pretty cold, to be honest. There are a lot of people who seem to be trying to excuse what has happened rather than to explain what has happened, particularly on a certain strand of what you might call the Corbynite left over here in the UK. I do remember what things were like when 9/11 happened, and trying to walk that line myself to explain why, to make what happened, explicable, but without excusing it. But people take explanations as excuses. So I sometimes wonder if my visceral reaction to what the ostensible left is saying is just me negatively reacting to them trying to explain rather than to excuse. But now that Israel has begun, counter-attacking, bombarding, airstrikes, etc., you can compare and contrast the way that the ostensible left reacted to the Hamas attacks and the way that they are reacting to Israel's counterattacks and frankly revenge bombings, and there is a difference. They do treat the two things very differently from one another, and it is kind of disturbing. But yeah, I try to be nuanced. I try to understand both sides. I know people involved in activism on both sides. I know people in Israel, part of the nerd community, so there's a little bit of bias there, I suppose. But looking at what Hamas did, I've witnessed some horrific things by proxy this week. Some of them were me being fooled by all the misinformation that you're seeing online, so I would remind everyone to be very careful. Some of it not, though. And that will definitely affect you and affect your feeling and thinking on the topic. Lysander says, something that was pointed out to me is that this event is the single largest mass murder of Jews since the Holocaust. If that's true, and it probably is, that is something I think needs to be taken into account, and something that can make what has occurred more, again, explicable, if not excusable. The Jewish people have had existential threats to their very existence in the past, and so indiscriminate slaughter like this is perhaps going to hit a bit different, unless your people have similarly been the target of genocidal violence in the past. Kenneth says, my own sympathies usually default to the oppressed peoples in whatever situation. Same here, Kenneth. I don't think that this recent attack was good or wise, but I don't find it to be unexpected, shocking, surprising either. There is a long history behind the justified anger that fueled it. Still, lots of death and destruction falling on the people. It's sad and irritating, and no real solution is in sight. I think it was unexpected in terms of scale, and shocking and surprising in terms of sheer levels of interpersonal savagery and the way in which it seemed to target women and children as much as anybody else. You might say that's benevolently, we're benevolently sexist to expect women not to be targeted. After all, women serve equally in Israel's military and so on, but the violence against children seems pretty inexcusable, and intentional violence against children, not what they euphemistically call collateral damage, but very deliberate killings and kidnappings. Irritating doesn't seem powerful enough a word either. But again, I think it's explicable in terms of oppression, but not excusable. Nate says, this is a fairly long comment. Thank you, Jim, for being one of the few honest people in this hobby. I might not always agree, but I appreciate the honest thought. Hamas sent forces to attack women, children, and the elderly. They sent people to attack a peace concert. I don't think the concert was explicitly a peace concert, but there were peace activists at kibbutz which were attacked. So talk about your wrong targets. And younger people tend to be more in favour of peaceful solutions. So, yeah. There is zero comparison between Israel and Hamas. If Hamas occupied Israel, it would be the trains running on time and not the problems suffered by Palestinians under Israeli occupation. If Hamas and Fatah began to govern rather than stealing foreign aid, the situation would be very different for people under this so-called apartheid. Unfortunately for the Jews, the cycle of violence is the only option, in my opinion. There's zero opportunity to negotiate in good faith with a regime that attacks women and children. There is no credible partner at the other side of the table, and I don't know why people try to pretend that there is a path to peace out of this, even before this latest terror attack. If the Jews felt the same way, how many women and children do you think they could murder with their weapons of war? Far, far more than Hamas could, even when the Jews show restraint, as they have by and large. It will never be enough for those who support the side of terrorism and hatred of Jews. And I do not believe it's right to blame religion. It's the excuse, not the reason. And I would say the same about sectarian violence between the Catholic Irish and the Anglican British. Religion provided excuses for inhumanity, not the reasons for it. The excuse allows gangsters and criminals in positions of power to steal more money while the common people suffer. I think the line between excuse and reason is pretty blurred, certainly in case of the sectarian violence in Ireland, but even more so here. I mean, we do have a religion that says explicitly that this land belongs to certain people, right? And we have another religion which tells you that people of the other religion are evil and to be destroyed. That's hard to get around if you're a believer. So I do think there is a moral difference and an ethical difference between what Hamas does and what Israel does. It's not like there's a shortage of military targets Hamas could have gone after, or even infrastructural targets, but they chose to go after kibbutzes, a music festival, peace activists, women and children, and to visit grotesque violence upon them, personal violence. That while that doesn't excuse anything that Israel has done, I think military action is, and euphemistically collateral damage, is in a different moral and ethical sphere to that. Sam Harris put out a rather good sort of assessment of this, similar to many of the things that Nate says here. That's worth listening to if you can find it on his YouTube channel or his podcasting. I think it's on that as well. But yeah, that was a fairly clear-sighted analysis from someone who often gets in very deep trouble from trying to be nuanced and understanding about things. So yeah, I can't discount religion to the same degree, because it's pretty much the reason for the whole conflict in the first place, and religion isn't amenable to reason. There are plenty of people on the Palestinian side that do want peace. It's just their representatives aren't those people, and they're not the people in charge. If Hamas ends up being broken, then maybe someone else can rise up. But at the moment, the cycle of violence is very much up. The Jews don't seem to want to make any peace, or rather Israel, I should say, and the Palestinians or Hamas don't seem to want to move to any kind of peace either. And there's plenty of saber rattling from other Islamic nations and so on around them. So yeah, I don't see a way forward except over a big pile of bodies, unfortunately, and that's very depressing. Justin Thor says, did you have solidarity with any and all the countries Israel's been bombing continuously on its borders since its founding? No. Yeah, I do have a lot of sympathy for the Palestinians. For the various countries that sponsor terrorism or have actively invaded Israel in the past, I have a lot less sympathy for them, and that's just the way it is. Maybe it's because I've been caught up in IRA terrorism in the past, or some other reason. But I feel for the Palestinians. I think they should have their own state, but I recognise that that's an unpopular opinion amongst many of my Israeli friends. But it's hard to see a way to any sort of peace that's possible anytime soon. So, and also there hasn't been anything on this sort of scale for a great many years. So, I felt solidarity with my American friends after 9/11, while also feeling horrified at what I knew America was about to do, and then did, and I felt sympathy and some sense of solidarity with those in Afghanistan who were so horribly impacted and continue to be horribly impacted by America's occupation. So, and it's the same way I feel here, but, who was it who suffered the terrible terrorist attacks on their civilian population? And, I made that video before the counter strikes and so on had really begun. So, yeah, it was an untempered outpouring of sorrow at what had happened in Israel and horror at what had happened in Israel. Yeah, this is the difference between empathy and compassion, I think. As Rutger Bregman says, temper your empathy, train your compassion. Because when you feel empathy, you're feeling what someone else feels. You are putting yourself in their position to some degree and reacting how they are reacting. While with compassion, you are still understanding someone's situation, but you are trying to find some feeling, some way of helping them. To feel empathy for a junkie, you might, give them money for drugs or score for them. Whereas the compassionate approach, is not empathetic. It is helping them kick the habit, right? And here, empathy would be feeling the same rage that many Israelis are feeling now, or feeling the same rage that many Palestinians were feeling in the lead up to this. Whereas compassion is understanding where that hatred and those problems, those issues come from, but looking for some sort of solution, even while nobody else is looking for any sort of solution. And the only solution seems to be a two-state solution, but nobody is going to want to do anything about that for a very long time, I would expect. I guess we'll see what happens. But try not to hate everybody for the actions of some in the meantime.
Daikaiju Dai is a game about beating up monsters in giant mecha. The players take the part of mecha pilots and their support crew, using the fate system to allow the one to influence the other. They will fight giant monsters and walk in their shadow. They will establish rivalries and defeat villains. They will uncover conspiracies and lead the fight back against what seems to be a world itself in rebellion against humanity. Mostly, though, they'll smash giant monsters to pieces in epic, destructive fights. Available from post-mort.com, lulu.com and drive-thru RPG.